Man who does not master himself will always be mastered by others, by their opinions, by their expectations, by their silence, by their approval, and without realizing it, he becomes a follower in his own life. Machiavelli understood this clearly. If you cannot control yourself, you will be controlled by the world. And that is the quiet downfall of most men. Not failure in public, but surrender in private. 1. The moment you stop prioritizing yourself, you start losing your life. The first mistake a man makes is not choosing others over himself once. It is doing it repeatedly until it becomes his identity. He starts small. He ignores his needs to please others. He delays his goals to make others comfortable. He sacrifices his time to avoid disappointing people. And at first, it feels harmless, even noble, but slowly something shifts. He begins to disappear from his own life. Because every time you abandon yourself for others, you reinforce one belief: I'm not as important as them. And that belief quietly destroys self-respect. Machiavelli would say this differently. A man who is not dangerous to lose will never be valued. Because value is not just given, it is perceived through boundaries. When you always put others first, you teach them that your time is flexible, your energy is accessible, your presence is guaranteed. And what is guaranteed is rarely respected. But when a man begins to prioritize himself, something powerful changes. He becomes selective. He becomes intentional. He becomes grounded in his own direction. And suddenly, people start paying attention differently. Not because he is louder, but because he is no longer everywhere for everyone. And here is the truth most men never realize. You cannot build a respected life while constantly abandoning yourself. At some point, you must decide, do I live for approval or alignment? Do I chase acceptance or self-respect? Do I serve my life or let my life be consumed by others? Because every decision answers that question, and every repeated decision becomes your identity. Now here is where the real shift begins. Because mastering yourself is not just about discipline. It is about removing emotional dependence on the world. And that leads to something most men fear to confront. Man who cannot control himself will spend his entire life trying to control how others see him. He will adjust his words to be accepted. He will shrink his presence to avoid rejection. He will sacrifice his truth just to remain liked. And in doing so, he becomes invisible, not because he lacks value, but because he abandoned it. Machiavelli understood something most men refuse to accept. Respect is never given to the man who seeks it. It is given to the man who stands without needing it. And that is where everything begins. Because the moment you prioritize being liked, you lose the power to be respected. You become predictable, available, easy to ignore. People sense it without you saying a word. They feel that your actions are not driven by purpose, but by approval. And nothing weakens a man faster than that. Because approval is unstable. It changes with mood. It changes with people. It changes with circumstances. So the man who depends on it will always feel uncertain, always adjusting, always second-guessing, always waiting to be validated. And that is not strength. That is quiet dependence. The kind that looks normal on the outside, but destroys you internally. Now understand this clearly. The world does not respect the man who needs it. It respects the man who does not depend on it. And the difference between those two men is self-mastery. Because when you master yourself, you stop negotiating your value. You stop explaining your worth. You stop chasing recognition. Instead, you build silently. You act intentionally. You move with direction. And that alone changes how people see you. Not because you asked for attention, but because your presence demands it. Now here is where most men fail. They try to change how others treat them, without first changing how they treat themselves. They want respect, but they don't respect their own time. They want attention, but they don't build anything worth noticing. They want power, but they avoid discipline. And that contradiction is what keeps them stuck. Because you cannot become a man no one can ignore, while ignoring yourself. That is the truth most people avoid. And until you confront it, nothing changes. Why trying to be liked instantly lowers your value. Machiavelli's ruthless truth most men ignore. Trying to be liked feels harmless, feels polite, feels socially intelligent. But beneath it, there is a quiet weakness most men refuse to see. Because the moment you start trying to be liked, you begin adjusting yourself. You soften your opinions. You filter your thoughts. You hesitate before speaking. Not because you're strategic, but because you're afraid of losing approval. And that fear changes everything. Machiavelli understood this with brutal clarity. The man who depends on approval becomes controlled by it. Because now your behavior is no longer yours. It belongs to whoever you're trying to impress. You become reactive. If they respond well, you feel confident. If they withdraw, you feel uncertain. Your emotional state becomes tied to their reaction, and that is the beginning of weakness. Because control has already shifted from you to them. Now here's the part most men don't realize. People can feel this instantly, not through your words, but through your energy. They sense hesitation. They sense over-adjustment. They sense that you're trying. And when someone is trying to be liked, they are unconsciously lowering their own value. Because value does not beg for acceptance. It stands on its own. The Stoics believed in something similar. What you control defines your strength. What controls you defines your weakness. And if approval controls you, you are not free. You are negotiating your identity in real time. Now think about this. A man who speaks clearly, acts with certainty, and doesn't seek validation may not be liked by everyone, but he will be respected. And respect lasts longer than approval. Because approval is emotional. Respect is structural. Approval changes quickly. Respect builds over time. And once it is established, it is difficult to ignore. This is why the moment you stop trying to be liked, your presence changes. You become less predictable, less available, more grounded. And that shift creates something powerful. Attention. Not because you demanded it, but because you are no longer giving your energy away freely. Now understand this. This is not about being arrogant. It's about being centered. Because arrogance seeks dominance. But self-mastery creates stability. And stability is what makes a man difficult to ignore. But here's where it becomes even deeper. Because stopping the need for approval is only the first step. The real transformation begins when you learn to prioritize yourself without guilt. And that is where most men struggle the most. Why prioritizing yourself feels wrong at first, and why that feeling is the key to your power. Prioritizing yourself will feel wrong at first, not because it is wrong, but because you've been conditioned to believe it is. You've been taught to be agreeable, to be available, to put others first so you can be accepted. So the moment you begin to choose yourself, something inside you resists. You feel guilty. You feel selfish. You feel like you're doing something you shouldn't. And most men stop right there. They go back to old patterns, back to pleasing, back to sacrificing themselves for comfort. Because discomfort feels like danger. But Machiavelli would see this differently. He would say, the moment something feels uncomfortable is often the moment you are stepping into power. Because growth never feels familiar. It feels uncertain. It feels isolating. It feels like you're losing something. And in a way, you are. You're losing the version of yourself that depended on others. The version that needed approval. The version that feared being misunderstood. The version that traded respect for acceptance. And letting go of that identity feels like loss, but it's actually liberation. Now here's the deeper truth. When you start prioritizing yourself, people will notice. Not always positively. Some will question you. Some will resist the change. Some will try to pull you back into your old role because they were comfortable with the version of you that was easy to access, easy to influence, easy to predict. But the moment you change, that comfort disappears. And this is where most men break. They confuse resistance with wrongdoing. They think, maybe I'm doing too much. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I should go back. But understand this clearly. Discomfort is not a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're no longer who you used to be. And that is exactly the point. Because becoming a man no one can ignore requires separation. Separation from old habits. Separation from external dependence. Separation from the need to be understood by everyone. The Stoics practiced this deeply. They didn't seek comfort. They sought alignment. And alignment often requires standing alone. Now ask yourself, can you choose your growth, even when it feels uncomfortable? Can you prioritize your path, even when others don't understand it? Can you hold your ground without needing validation? Because that is where your power begins. Not when it feels easy, but when you stay committed despite the discomfort. And once you pass this stage, something changes permanently. Because now, you are no longer reacting to life. You are directing it. But here's the next level most men never reach. Because prioritizing yourself is one thing, but mastering your mind is what makes you unstoppable. Why mastering your mind is the real source of power and why most men never achieve it. Mastering your mind is where everything changes. Because until you do, you are not in control of your life. You are reacting to emotions, reacting to people, reacting to circumstances, and every reaction pulls you further away from who you could become. Machiavelli understood this in a way most people overlook. Power is not what you show externally. It is what you control internally. Because a man who cannot control his thoughts will always be controlled by his impulses. One moment he is focused, the next moment he is distracted. One moment he is confident, the next moment he is uncertain. His direction changes based on how he feels. And feelings are unstable. They rise, they fall, they shift without warning. So the man who depends on them will never be consistent. And without consistency, there is no power. Now here is the truth most men avoid. You don't lack potential. You lack control over your mind. Because your mind is undisciplined. It chases comfort. It avoids difficulty. It seeks distraction. And every time you follow it blindly, you weaken your ability to lead yourself. The Stoics trained for this daily. They didn't try to eliminate thoughts. They learned to observe them without obeying them. Because there is a difference between having a thought and acting on it. And that difference is where self-mastery lives. Now imagine this. A man who feels fear, but still acts. A man who feels doubt, but stays consistent. A man who feels pressure, but remains calm. That man becomes unpredictable in the most powerful way. Because he is no longer controlled by emotion. He is guided by intention. And intention creates direction. Direction creates momentum. Momentum creates presence. And presence is what makes a man impossible to ignore. Now understand this clearly. Mastering your mind is not about perfection. It is about control under pressure. Because life will always test you. People will challenge you. Situations will frustrate you. Uncertainty will appear. And in those moments, your mind will try to take over. It will push you to react, to rush, to lose composure. But if you've trained it, you don't follow it. You lead it. And that is the difference between a man who reacts and a man who commands. But here's where it becomes even more powerful. Because once you master your mind, you begin to control something else most men completely overlook. Your time. And how you use your time determines the level of your life. Why wasting time is the fastest way to become irrelevant, and how disciplined men use time differently. Time is the only thing you can't negotiate with. You can delay success, You can recover from mistakes. You can rebuild after failure. But you can never get your time back. And most men treat it like it's unlimited. They waste hours without thinking. They distract themselves to avoid discomfort. They tell themselves, "I'll start tomorrow." And tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. And before they realize it, years are gone. Machiavelli would see this as weakness. Because a man who cannot control his time, cannot control his life. Time is not just something you spend. It is something you either invest or lose. There is no middle ground. Every hour you waste is an hour someone else is using to improve, to build, to grow, to become more disciplined. And over time, that gap becomes impossible to ignore. This is how men become irrelevant. Not because they lack talent, but because they lack urgency. They wait for the right moment. They wait to feel ready. They wait for motivation. But disciplined men don't wait. They act, even when they don't feel like it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when progress is slow, because they understand something most people ignore. Consistency beats intensity. Not what you do once, but what you repeat daily. Now here's the deeper truth. When you don't control your time, something else will. Distractions, entertainment, other people's priorities. And without realizing it, you start living a life that isn't yours. You wake up reactive. You move without direction. You end your day without progress. And that cycle repeats until you feel stuck. Not because you can't move forward, but because you never took control of your time. The Stoics lived with urgency, not panic, but awareness. They understood that life is finite, and that awareness created discipline. Because when you truly understand that your time is limited, you stop wasting it. You become intentional. You choose your actions carefully. You protect your focus. You eliminate what doesn't serve your growth. And that alone separates you from most people. Because while others are distracted, you are building. While others are delaying, you are progressing. While others are waiting, you are becoming. And over time, that difference becomes undeniable. But here's where it goes even deeper. Because controlling your time is not enough. If you don't control your habits, you will eventually lose control again. And habits are what truly define the man you become. Why your habits are quietly building or destroying you. Machiavelli's perspective on discipline and identity. Your life is not built by big moments. It is built by small actions repeated daily. What you do when no one is watching. What you choose when it's inconvenient. What you repeat without thinking. That is what defines you. Machiavelli would not judge a man by his intentions. He would judge him by his patterns. Because intentions mean nothing if they are not supported by consistent action. And habits are those actions. On autopilot. Now here's the truth most men ignore. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. If your habits are weak, your life will reflect it. You wake up late. You delay important tasks. You choose comfort over discipline. And you tell yourself, "I'll fix it later." But later never comes. Because habits don't change with intention. They change with repetition. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't rely on motivation. They built systems. They created routines that removed decision-making. So discipline became automatic. Because the less you rely on how you feel, the more consistent you become. Now look at your life honestly. Your current results are not random. They are a reflection of what you do every day. Your focus, your energy, your progress. All of it is shaped by your habits. And if those habits are not aligned with growth, you are slowly moving in the wrong direction, even if you don't feel it yet. This is how most men fail quietly, not through one major mistake, but through daily neglect. Small delays, small distractions, small compromises that accumulate over time until the gap between who they are and who they could have been becomes painful. Now here's the shift. When you change your habits, you change your identity. Because every repeated action sends a message to your mind. This is who I am. If you act with discipline, you become disciplined. If you act with focus, you become focused. If you act with intention, you become intentional. And that identity becomes unshakable because it is built on proof. Not words, not promises, but evidence. Now understand this clearly. You don't need more motivation. You need better habits. Because motivation fades, but habits remain. And once they are built correctly, they carry you forward, even when you don't feel like moving. But here's where most men struggle again. Because building habits requires something they try to avoid. Consistency without immediate reward. And that is where real discipline is tested. Why most men quit before results appear, and how to stay disciplined when nothing seems to be working. Most men don't fail because they lack ability. They fail because they quit too early. Not when things are impossible, but when results are invisible. They start strong. They feel motivated. They take action for a few days, maybe a few weeks. But then something happens. Nothing changes. No recognition. No visible progress. No immediate reward. And that silence breaks them. They begin to question everything. Is this even working? Am I wasting my time? Maybe this isn't for me. And slowly, they stop. Not because they couldn't succeed, but because they couldn't endure the phase where nothing seems to happen. Machiavelli understood this kind of weakness. Because true power is not tested when things are working. It is tested when nothing appears to be changing. That is where most men separate from their potential. Now here's the truth most people never accept. Progress is not always visible. In fact, the most important progress happens quietly. Your discipline is building. Your focus is strengthening. Your habits are stabilizing. But because you can't see it yet, you assume it's not happening. And that assumption becomes your downfall. The Stoics trained themselves to ignore immediate results. They focused on action, not outcome, because outcomes are delayed. But actions are within your control. Now think about this. If you only act when you see progress, you will never stay consistent long enough to achieve anything meaningful. Because every meaningful transformation has a phase of invisibility, a period where you are working, but nothing externally reflects it. And that phase is where most people give up. But disciplined men stay. They continue showing up. They continue executing. They continue building, even when there is no evidence yet. Because they understand something powerful. Consistency creates results, even when results are not yet visible. And over time, that invisible effort compounds. Until one day, it becomes undeniable. Now here's where it becomes personal. Are you the man who stops when it gets quiet? Or the man who continues when no one is watching? Because that decision determines everything. Not your talent, not your potential, not your circumstances, but your ability to stay consistent. When nothing seems to be working, that is where power is built. And once you develop that level of discipline, you become extremely difficult to compete with. Because while others quit, you continue. And over time, that difference becomes massive. But here's the next level most men never reach. Because discipline alone is not enough. If you don't control your emotions, you will eventually sabotage everything you've built. Why emotional control is the final level of power, and why most men lose everything here. Emotions are powerful, but uncontrolled emotions are dangerous. Because they don't ask for permission. They rise suddenly. They influence decisions instantly. They distort logic without warning. And most men don't even realize when it's happening. One moment they are focused. The next moment they are reacting. Anger, frustration, pride, insecurity. And in that emotional state, they say things they shouldn't. They make decisions they regret. They break discipline they built for weeks. Machiavelli understood this clearly. A man who is ruled by emotion will always be ruled by circumstance. Because emotions are reactive, They respond to what happens outside of you. And if your inner state is controlled by external events, you are not in control of your life. Now here's the deeper truth. Most men don't lose because they are weak. They lose because they react too quickly. They respond instead of observe. They act instead of think. They explode instead of stabilize. And every emotional reaction pulls them further away from their goals. The Stoics built their entire philosophy around this one principle. Control what is inside you. Ignore what you cannot control outside. Because external chaos will always exist. People will challenge you. Situations will frustrate you. Life will test your patience. But your response, that is yours. And that is where power lives. Now imagine a man who does not react instantly. He pauses. He observes. He thinks before he responds. That man becomes unpredictable in a powerful way. Because he is no longer driven by emotion. He is guided by intention. And intention creates control. Control creates stability. And stability creates respect. Because people feel when a man is not easily shaken. Now here is where most men fail again. They confuse emotional control with emotional suppression. But they are not the same. Suppression is hiding emotion. Control is understanding it, without letting it lead you. That is mastery. And once you reach that level, you stop being manipulated by your own reactions. You stop being controlled by temporary feelings. You stop losing progress because of emotional moments. And instead, you become steady, consistent, grounded, unshakable. Now here is the final truth. A man who controls his emotions, controls his decisions. And a man who controls his decisions, controls his life. But there is still one final stage most men never reach. Because even after discipline and emotional control, there is something deeper that separates average men from unforgettable ones. Why a man who masters himself becomes impossible to ignore. The final transformation. When a man finally masters himself, something shifts that cannot be faked. He no longer chases attention, but attention starts finding him. He no longer begs for respect, but respect begins to follow his presence. Because self-mastery changes the way you move through the world. Not louder, not aggressive, not desperate, but calm, centered, intentional. And that presence is rare. Most people are noisy on the outside, but unstable on the inside. They speak too much. They react too fast. They seek validation constantly. But a man who has mastered himself has no need to prove anything. Machiavelli understood this clearly. Power is most effective when it does not announce itself, because silence combined with strength creates pressure in the minds of others. They start to notice. Why is he so calm? Why doesn't he react like others? Why does he seem unaffected? And that curiosity becomes attention. Now here is the deeper truth. You don't become unforgettable by trying to stand out. You become unforgettable by becoming stable in a world that is unstable. Because instability is everywhere. People change opinions quickly. Emotions shift constantly. Attention moves rapidly. But the man who remains consistent stands out without effort. Now think about this. When you prioritize yourself, when you master your habits, when you control your emotions, when you stop chasing approval, you begin to remove weakness from your identity. And what remains is strength. Not performative strength, but internal strength. The kind that does not need validation to exist. And that is what people feel first, before you even speak. Because presence always speaks louder than words. Now here is where everything comes together. Self-mastery is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming unshakable in your direction. So no matter what happens around you, you do not lose yourself. You do not break your focus. You do not abandon your path. You do not lower your standards. You remain aligned. And alignment creates power. Because now your life is not reactive. It is intentional. And when a man lives with intention, he becomes difficult to ignore, not because he demands attention, but because he no longer wastes his life trying to earn it. That is the final transformation. If this message opened your eyes, don't let it end here, because most men will hear this and return to the same patterns. But you don't have to. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to the channel for more Machiavellian mindset, stoic discipline, and self-mastery content. Because the man who masters himself first becomes the man no one can ignore.